Welcome to Fantastic Vision. Please subscribe us before you watch today's video. On December 18th, the United States suddenly issued a sky-high fine to Chinese graphite, imposing a tariff of up to 920%. What does this mean? It means that a piece of graphite originally sold for 10 yuan, but now it has to sell for 92 yuan, which is 9 times more. The United States operation this time can be said to be too much, directly tearing off the mask of free trade. Shouting fair competition, turning around to set obstacles for opponents. But the question is, does China really need to rely on low prices to grab your American market? 90% of the world's graphite supply is in China's hands, and the United States market share is not even a fraction. What's more, once graphite is not sold to the United States, it will not only be unlucky for China, but I'm afraid that the United States itself will really have a headache. Graphite may be unfamiliar to many people, but it is an indispensable material in lithium-ion batteries. Whether it is a mobile phone, a computer, or an electric car, this material is indispensable. In 2024, the world is desperately developing new energy, and the United States is no exception. However, China has firmly grasped 90% of the global supply of such an important graphite resource. Especially in the battery market for electric vehicles, China has occupied 92% of the market share. In contrast, the graphite industry in the United States has long been hollowed out and is almost completely dependent on imports. The United States is anxious. They are worried that their own industry will be overwhelmed by China, so they found a reason to say that Chinese graphite is dumping and destroys fair competition for American companies. Then, the American Anode Material Production Alliance, AAAMP, stood up and proposed to the U.S. Department of Commerce to impose a 920% tariff on Chinese graphite. This decision not only caused a wave in the global graphite market, but also made people see the other face of the so-called free trade. The problem is actually the word price. The United States says that China's graphite is sold too cheaply. The reason behind this is that the Chinese government subsidizes related companies, so Chinese graphite can be dumped at low prices. The logic of the United States is that China has grabbed their market at low prices, causing American companies to survive. This sounds reasonable, but if you think about it carefully, is the problem really that simple? First of all, China's graphite industry does have an absolute advantage in the world. This is not due to the so-called dumping, but because China has long been far ahead in mineral resources, technology accumulation, and industrial chain integrity. Secondly, the United States is highly dependent on Chinese graphite, especially electric car giants like Tesla, whose battery production cannot be separated from graphite. Once China reduces exports, American companies will immediately fall into trouble. Therefore, the United States is under the banner of fair competition and is actually afraid that its own industry will be affected, so it is anxious to impose tariffs on China. The United States first imposed a 25% tariff on Chinese graphite before 2024, but it obviously had little impact on China's graphite exports. So this time the tax rate was directly raised to 920%. This is equivalent to telling China, don't sell graphite to the United States anymore. This approach not only angered Chinese companies, but also shocked the entire international market. Faced with the US move, China did not immediately fight back, but everyone can see that China has many options. China has an absolute say in the global graphite market, and the small market of the United States is not indispensable. In other words, China can sell graphite to Europe, Asia or other countries, and in this way, American companies will be in trouble. Especially for those industries that rely on batteries, such as new energy vehicles and energy storage equipment, the high price of graphite will eventually be transmitted to the cost of products, and consumers will naturally have to pay for it. The 920% tariff of the United States is ostensibly to protect its own companies, but behind it is actually its own guilty conscience. The current situation of the graphite industry is that China has already opened up the entire industrial chain. From mineral mining to high-quality processing, Chinese companies are not only efficient, but also low-cost. In contrast, the graphite industry in the United States is almost non-existent. Even if the United States wants to support local companies to rebuild the industrial chain now, this is not a problem that can be solved within a few years. Some people may ask, can the United States really protect its own industry with such a high tariff policy? The answer is obviously no. Take electric vehicles as an example. Graphite is the core material of batteries. Without graphite, American electric vehicle companies are basically half useless. Moreover, graphite is not only needed by the United States, but the world is scrambling for this resource. As long as China slightly adjusts its export direction and sells more graphite to other countries, American battery manufacturers will have to pay higher costs and even face supply shortages. What's more interesting is that the United States accuses China of dumping while relying on government subsidies to protect its own agriculture and high-tech companies. Such double standards behavior inevitably makes people wonder whether the United States wants to protect its industry or maintain its position by suppressing its opponents. The 920% tariff policy of the United States this time seems to have suppressed China's graphite exports, but in fact it is shooting itself in the foot. China can not only shift its export market, but also raise global graphite prices by restricting exports. In the end, the biggest impact may be on the battery industry and consumers in the United States. In the short term, it is impossible for the United States to establish its own graphite supply chain. There will be no winners in this trade war, but the biggest loser may be the United States itself. So the question is, can the United States really restrict China? If China sells less graphite, the export market can still be adjusted, but how should the problem of industrial hollowing out in the United States be solved? If the price of graphite is allowed to rise, won't American companies and ordinary people suffer in the end? Can the so-called protectionism really protect their future? This trade dispute is not only about the competition for graphite, but also about the game of global economic structure. Who can survive to the end? Time will give the answer.